What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another edition of interAXEtion, where we're going to answer your music theory questions. You guys left a lot of great comments on the last video. I'll try to answer some of them. Some of them are actually replied to. If you do have any music theory questions that are bothering you, leave it in the comments below, or send me an email, or tweet at me, or something. So, for the sake of brevity, first question. I understand how to make chords from chord books. I just don't understand why those chords are the way they are, and what will sound good with them, or how to apply them to writing. Now, this is an extremely common question, so before I answer it, unfortunately, music theory is an extremely general term that encompasses a lot of different concepts. It's kind of like saying, I want to learn math. What the hell does that mean? You want to add and subtract, or trigonometry, or astrophysics? There are a ton of different concepts within that. Same thing for music theory. And if you don't understand the basic fundamentals of, basic chord construction, distance between notes and stuff like that, some of the more, I don't want to even say advanced, but some of the more concepts further along, like chord progressions and key centers, can be a little confusing because you just don't even understand how chords are formed. Now, somebody left in a great reply to this question talking about how chords are formed. You take a scale and it's every other note, or thirds, right? Every other note form those chords, and every three notes is what we call a triad. And if you take a scale and put all those together, you get what they call a chord scale. Now, unfortunately, if you don't know some of that, figuring out, well, which chords are minor and which chords are major, again, can be hard because you don't know basic intervals. So that's why the chord scale is helpful, at least to remember the basic major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished kind of idea. At least then you know what you're dealing with. But I just actually wanted to expand on the reply. Okay? Again, they gave a great reply of how to form chords, and that's a good start of it. Now, realize that as you stack these chords, for instance, you have the C major was the example. So every other note in the C major scale was C, skip the note D, you get E, skip F, you get G, so you get C, E, G. Right? So we're skipping every other note. Now, if we add one before that and one after that, then you get A, C, E, G, B. Now, if you look at that, you actually have an A minor chord, A, C, E, a C major chord, C, E, G, and an E minor chord, E, G, B. Okay? They're all in the key of C major. Now, what that means is all of those chords tend to sound similar to each other outside of the quality, major or minor, which means they can be played in place of each other. So if you take a chord scale, right, take those three chords that I just mentioned in the key of C major, that's your 1 chord, your 3 chord, and your 6 chord. Those are all basically tonic or C major kind of chords. Okay, and then we can do the same thing with a couple other chords. You can do it with the 2 chord and the 4 chord, right? D, F, A, or F, A, C. Right? If I put the C on the first one, it's just a D minor 7 chord. So again, those 2 chords are going to sound very similar. And then you can do the same thing for the 5 and 7 chord. And those 2 chords are going to sound very similar. So even though you have chord quality, major and minor, now we have this kind of root sounding chord on the 1, 3, or 6 chords. You have something that's going to set up your dominant chord, which is your 2 or your 4 chord, and then you have your dominant chord, which is your tension, right? So you can have your 5 or your 7 chord, which is diminished, and that's tension. And you put those together, and that's how you create chord progressions, which is why you have the famous 1, 5, 1, 4, 5 progressions, or the 4, 5, 1 progression, just start on 4. Same thing in jazz, you have your 2, 5, 1. Notice what we have, 4, 5, 1, 2, 5, 1. You have the predominant chord, or the chord that sets up the tension, then you have the tension, and then you have the resolution to the 1 chord. And that, in a very extremely brief and overstated nutshell, is how chord progressions work. So look at some jazz standards, look at blues progression songs, look at pop songs, and you should be able to find these relationships within chords. And I know that's hard to swallow and it's hard to understand, but that's basically how chord progressions work. Second question. This is a great series you started. Thank you. I think you will be very popular. I hope so. My question is, when adding outside notes to a melody or a solo, how do you know what notes to add? Using C major as an example, what notes aren't from the scale that I could add and why? Thanks. Now, this is a great question, but it's also a little general because there's no chord progression. So it's hard to talk about what notes to add when I don't know what chords you're playing over. But if we're playing over just a C major vamp, there are things we can do to add some color. We can add, just staying on C, we can alter the C major chord, right? We can take the 4th degree and raise it up 1, a sharp 4 or a sharp 11 chord. Now you have that sound, the Lydian sound. So that's a sound that's outside. So you can play with that. you can change the chord, you can change the fifth of the chord, you can raise a sharp 5. Then essentially you're making a C major 7 with a sharp 5. And that's the Simpsons chord or the Lord of the Rings chord, right? Again, those are outside notes that create tension that's still based on C. You can also imply other chords as you're playing. And the easiest one is just to imply a dominant. So if you're playing a C major, you're obviously going to be targeting notes that make a C major chord, right? So now we can move over into the fifth or the dominant of that, which would be G major or G7. We can target those notes, right? You don't really want to play F over a C major chord because it's going to clash with the third. So that's going to create a tension. So if you want to create resolution back to the C chord, you can emphasize that note alone. So you're emphasizing G. That being said, you see a lot in jazz and blues, they play altered dominants, right? Or something based off of that. And so that's what you can do. You can go to a whole bunch of different modes based off of G that emphasize an altered dominant. Some melodic minor sounds, some super locrian sound, which is part of the melodic minor. And you can do all of that. And again, I know it's kind of vague in general, but for brevity, we don't really have time to get into it all. But we can imply quickly, add A flat, right? You're playing C major and play some G7 with an A flat. This way you get a G7 flat 9 kind of sound, and then resolve that. And you can work on it that way. You can still obviously use the minor third over the C to create that kind of inflection, like a blues inflection, minor major third, but that would probably work better over the dominant chord as well. But basically your answer lies into implying dominant progressions within what you're playing. Next question, how can you use the Prometheus scale? It's basically the Lydian dominant scale, just that it's lacking the perfect 5, and thus is a hexatonic scale. In jazz, you can use the Lydian dominant to solo over a 5/7 chord, but I just can't find where the Prometheus scale fits in. Thanks. Now, you're having trouble finding where the Prometheus scale fits in because it doesn't. When this was first created, it wasn't intended to be a scale. It was from a composition, and the composer made a chord. They called it the mystic chord. And in this time period, in the middle of the 20th century, modern music with atonality and all that stuff, there was a lot of experimenting with pitches of class or a class pitch. And that's what this is. It's a group of notes designed to limit and enhance creativity, right? What can you do with these group of notes? What tensions can I come up with? What chords can I come up with? What melodies can I come up with? And that's where the origin of the Prometheus scale comes in. It really wasn't meant to be a scale or a mode or anything like that, any of the hexatonic scales. But it's been since used by then, and you're absolutely right. It's basically the Lydian dominant without the 5, or the Lydian augmented without the 5, and that right there should answer your question. You can use it in that context. My buddy Jens left a great reply to this comment, so I hope you read it. He talks about all the different melodic minor chords that you can go into, so I'm not going to need to expand on that. You can also check out his channel because he does a lot of heavy jazz lessons, and it's phenomenal. So there you go. This week's questions. Thanks very much for tuning in. I hope that answers some of you. If this sparks a question in your head, please leave it down below in the comment section. Till then, I'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.